Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one last time. Who do you think you are? The words sliced through the warm chatter of the little roadside diner, just as forks stopped halfway to waiting mouths and fresh coffee steamed beneath the glow of hanging amber lights. Every conversation died in an instant. Every pair of eyes drifted toward the same corner booth where Senator Angela Brooks sat quietly with a half-finished slice of pecan pie and a cup of black coffee she had barely touched. She didn't stand. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked up at the white police officer towering beside her table, her calm expression almost impossible to understand in a room filling with tension. Officer Ethan Walker rested one hand near the handcuffs on his duty belt while the other pointed toward her driver's license lying beside the receipt. He studied it for another second before letting out a short laugh that carried across the diner. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. "A United States senator doesn't walk into a place like this by herself." A nervous silence spread across the room. The waitress behind the counter froze with a glass coffee pot still raised in midair. An elderly couple near the window exchanged uncertain glances. A truck driver quietly lowered his newspaper. Angela folded her hands together on the table. "Officer, if you have concerns, you're welcome to verify my identity through dispatch," she answered evenly. "I'll gladly cooperate." Her voice never carried anger. It carried patience, somehow that only seemed to irritate him more. Walker shook his head. That's exactly what someone trying to fool people would say. A young mother sitting 2 booths away instinctively pulled her little boy a little closer without taking her eyes off the scene unfolding only a few yards away. Outside, morning sunlight reflected across parked pickup trucks and family sedans while the American flag above the diner fluttered gently in the cool breeze, completely unaware that inside, dignity was quietly being tested. Angela had entered the diner less than 20 minutes earlier, hoping for nothing more complicated than breakfast before another community meeting 2 counties away. She had left her security detail behind for the morning, insisting that people deserved to meet their elected officials without cameras, flashing lights, or barricades. She wore a simple navy sweater, dark jeans, and comfortable walking shoes instead of the tailored suits that usually surrounded her public appearances. Without the title, without the Capitol backdrop, she looked like any other customer passing through a small American town. That anonymity had always reminded her why she first entered public service. It also revealed truths few politicians ever witnessed. Walker picked up her driver's license once more, turning it between his fingers. "Fake IDs are getting better every year," he muttered. Angela met his eyes without flinching. "Then please run it." He ignored the suggestion completely. Instead, he reached toward his radio, speaking in a tone that sounded less like investigation and more like certainty. Around the diner, discomfort settled heavier than the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits drifting from the kitchen. No one seemed to know whether to speak or remain silent. Then, before another word could be exchanged, the front door swung open so quickly that the tiny bell above it rang twice. A frightened little boy rushed inside, his face pale and his breathing uneven. The moment he spotted Angela, his eyes filled with relief. "There she is," he cried, pointing straight toward her booth. "Mom, that's the lady who saved me." The little boy's voice echoed through the diner with a kind of honesty that adults could never imitate. Every head turned toward him before slowly shifting back to Angela Brooks. The child stood in the doorway, breathing hard, one small hand gripping the frame while the other pointed directly at her. His blonde hair was still slightly damp with sweat, and his bright red baseball cap hung crooked across his forehead as though he had put it on while running. A woman hurried in behind him, clearly his mother, her face flushed with worry. She stopped the moment she recognized the scene before her. Her son looked up at Officer Ethan Walker with wide, confused eyes. "She is the lady who helped me," he repeated. "She saved me." The words floated across the room, settling over every table like dust in morning sunlight. Walker frowned but did not step aside. "Son, stay back," he said firmly. "This is police business." The boy shook his head so quickly that his cap nearly slipped off. "No, it happened right outside. I could not breathe." His mother placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him, but her own breathing was uneven. She looked toward Angela, gratitude filling her eyes despite the uncomfortable situation. "Officer," she said carefully, "my son is telling the truth." Walker barely glanced at her before returning his attention to Angela's identification card still resting in his hand. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I have procedures to follow." The mother hesitated, then looked back at her son. Tears gathered in the boy's eyes, not from fear of the officer, but from frustration that no one seemed willing to listen. "She knelt down next to me," he said softly. "Everybody else just stood there. She told me to stay calm and keep breathing. She stayed with me until I felt better." The elderly couple near the window exchanged another glance. One of the truck drivers slowly removed his baseball cap, suddenly remembering the small crowd that had gathered outside less than 20 minutes earlier. The waitress quietly lowered the coffee pot onto the counter as memories began connecting like pieces of a forgotten puzzle. Angela remained seated, her shoulders relaxed despite every eye now resting upon her. She offered the boy a warm smile. "You are doing much better now," she said gently. "That is what matters." The child nodded with the unquestioning trust that only children possess. "Mom said I was lucky you were there." His mother swallowed hard before speaking again. "We never even got the chance to thank you properly. Everything happened so fast." Warm sunlight streamed through the large front windows, casting long golden reflections across the polished floor. The scent of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen while an old country song played quietly through worn ceiling speakers, creating a strange contrast to the silence gripping every customer. Outside, passing cars continued along the highway as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside, however, certainty had begun to crack. Walker shifted his weight slightly. Confidence still filled his posture, but something in the room had changed. The eyes watching him no longer reflected simple curiosity. They carried questions. Angela quietly folded the paper napkin beside her untouched coffee cup and placed it neatly on the table. Her calm never wavered. She looked at the frightened child, then at his mother, before finally meeting Walker's eyes once again. "Officer," she said with the same steady voice as before, "I have nowhere else to be until we establish the truth." Officer Ethan Walker slowly clipped the radio back onto his shoulder without answering Angela Brooks. The silence around him had become heavier than the weight of his badge, yet pride refused to let him step backward. He looked around the diner, noticing that nearly every customer had stopped eating. A pair of construction workers stood beside their booth, pretending to refill their coffee while listening to every word. The elderly man near the window quietly removed his glasses and polished them with a folded handkerchief, buying himself another excuse to keep watching. Even the cooks had paused behind the serving window, their white aprons dusted with flour as the scent of fresh biscuits drifted into the dining room. Walker finally spoke, his voice calm but unmistakably rigid. "One good deed does not answer the questions I have." Angela gave a small nod. "You are correct. That is why I suggested verifying my identification." She never sounded defensive. She sounded patient, almost as though she had lived through moments like this before. Walker picked up her driver's license again and compared it with her face for what seemed like the 10th time. He studied every detail, searching for something that would justify the certainty he already carried in his mind. The photograph matched. The birth date matched. The security markings reflected under the overhead lights exactly as they should. Still, he hesitated. Something inside him refused to believe that a black woman dressed in an ordinary sweater could truly be one of the most recognizable elected officials in the state. The little boy looked from Walker to Angela with growing confusion. "Why does he not believe you?" he whispered. His mother gently squeezed his shoulder, but had no answer. She only lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back toward Angela with quiet sympathy. Angela offered the child another reassuring smile. "Sometimes people need more information before they feel comfortable," she said softly. "It is all right." The kindness in her voice filled the room with an uncomfortable contrast. No accusation, no anger, only grace. Walker reached for the small computer mounted inside his patrol vehicle through the open front door, then stopped halfway. Instead, he turned toward the cashier. "Has anyone here actually seen this woman before today?" The young cashier hesitated. "No, sir." Walker nodded as though the answer confirmed everything he already believed. Then the waitress who had served Angela breakfast slowly stepped forward, drying nervous hands on her apron. "I had not seen her before today either," she admitted honestly, "but I watched her pay for another customer's breakfast without saying a word. I watched her help that little boy outside when everyone else froze. I cannot tell you who she is, officer, but I can tell you exactly how she has behaved since she walked through our door. Her words lingered in the air. They were simple, impossible to argue with, and spoken without anger. Walker looked around once more. The faces watching him had changed. They were no longer waiting to see whether the woman at the booth would prove herself. They were quietly waiting to see what kind of man the officer would choose to become. Outside, the distant rumble of another vehicle rolled across the highway before a dark government sedan turned into the diner's gravel parking lot, its polished windows reflecting the bright morning sun as it came to a slow, deliberate stop. The dark sedan rolled to a gentle stop outside the diner, its engine fading into silence as sunlight shimmered across the polished hood. Every eye near the front windows drifted toward it without anyone saying a word. Officer Ethan Walker glanced outside, then back toward Angela Brooks, refusing to let uncertainty show on his face. He squared his shoulders and convinced himself it was only another customer. Angela remained seated exactly as she had been, her hands resting lightly on the table beside the untouched coffee that had long since cooled. She did not turn toward the windows. She simply listened to the quiet rhythm of footsteps approaching the front entrance. The small brass bell above the diner door chimed softly as two professionally dressed men stepped inside. Both wore dark suits, neither displayed a badge, and both paused only long enough to survey the room before their attention settled naturally on Angela. The older of the two men smiled with visible relief. "Senator Brooks," he said warmly, "we have been trying to reach you for almost 20 minutes. A wave of silence swept through the diner. The waitress slowly covered her mouth with one hand. The truck drivers exchanged stunned glances. The little boy looked proudly toward his mother as though the truth had finally caught up with what he already knew. Walker stepped forward before either man could approach the booth. "Sir, I need to know who you are." The older gentleman calmly removed a leather credential wallet and held it where the officer could examine it. "Michael Hayes, Director of Executive Protection for the State Senate." Beside him, the younger man introduced himself as David Collins, Angela's legislative aide. Neither raised his voice. Neither appeared angry. Their calm professionalism somehow made the room even quieter. Walker studied the credentials for several seconds. Everything appeared authentic, yet his pride continued searching for another explanation. "If she is really a senator," he said carefully, "why would she be traveling without security?" Michael Hayes glanced toward Angela before answering. "Because she instructed us to remain several minutes behind her vehicle this morning. She wanted to visit local businesses without creating a public scene. She does that more often than people realize." Angela finally looked toward Walker again, her expression unchanged. "Public service means listening to people where they actually live," she said gently. "Sometimes that begins with sharing breakfast instead of standing behind a podium." The words landed softly, but they carried more weight than any accusation could have. Walker looked around the diner once again. The faces surrounding him no longer reflected doubt. They reflected understanding. The waitress quietly placed a fresh cup of coffee on Angela's table without asking, her hands trembling slightly. The elderly gentleman by the window slowly stood and removed his cap as a quiet gesture of respect. Outside, another breeze lifted the American flag above the diner, its fabric moving peacefully beneath the bright blue sky. Inside, however, one question still lingered unanswered. Walker's portable radio suddenly crackled to life with a sharp burst of static before dispatch spoke his name. "Officer Walker, stand by. You have an incoming priority call being transferred immediately." The officer frowned, lifted the radio toward his shoulder, and answered automatically. "Walker speaking." A brief pause followed. Then the dispatcher returned, her normally steady voice carrying an unusual edge of urgency. "Officer, please remain on the line. The governor's office is requesting to speak with you directly." Officer Ethan Walker pressed the radio closer to his shoulder, suddenly aware that every sound inside the diner had disappeared. Even the gentle clatter from the kitchen had stopped. The dispatcher spoke once more, her voice measured but unmistakably formal. "Officer, Governor Daniel Whitmore is on the line." Walker blinked, certain he had misheard. "Repeat that." "The governor is waiting, officer." A faint click followed, and then another voice came through the speaker, calm, steady, and instantly recognizable to nearly everyone in the state who had ever watched a news conference. "Officer Walker, this is Governor Daniel Whitmore." Walker stood a little straighter. "Good morning, Governor." The governor did not waste a second. "I have been informed that Senator Angela Brooks is currently being detained at Miller's Diner." Walker glanced toward Angela before answering. "Governor, I am conducting an investigation." Another brief silence followed. It felt far longer than it truly was. "Officer," the governor replied, "Senator Brooks is traveling today as part of my bipartisan rural outreach initiative. She is exactly where she is supposed to be. Her office informed mine that she prefers to meet residents without advance publicity. I need you to listen very carefully. She is a respected public servant, and she deserves the same professionalism that every citizen deserves. Is that understood?" Walker swallowed. His confident posture softened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Governor." "Good. I expect this situation to be resolved immediately, and I will be requesting a full incident report before the end of the day." The line went silent. Walker lowered the radio slowly, staring at it as though it had suddenly become unfamiliar in his own hand. No one inside the diner moved. The little boy looked toward his mother with wide eyes. The waitress quietly wiped away a tear she had not realized had formed. Michael Hayes remained respectfully silent, giving the officer space to decide what happened next. Angela Brooks had not changed her posture even once. She still sat with quiet dignity, her folded hands resting beside the fresh cup of coffee that now sent a thin ribbon of steam into the morning air. Warm sunlight stretched farther across the floor, illuminating the polished wood beneath their feet and reflecting softly against the silver napkin holder on the table. Walker finally looked directly at Angela. For the first time since entering the diner, certainty had disappeared from his face. In its place stood hesitation, embarrassment, and the uncomfortable realization that assumptions had carried him farther than facts ever had. He carefully returned her driver's license to the table without saying a word. His fingers lingered for only a moment before he stepped back. The room remained silent, not because anyone expected humiliation, but because everyone sensed that something more important than authority had just been placed on trial. Angela slowly picked up her identification card and slipped it back into her wallet. Her movements remained calm, unhurried, and completely free of triumph. She did not smile. She did not celebrate being proven right. She simply looked at the officer with the same steady expression she had carried since the first question had been asked. Outside, the American flag continued to wave gently above the roadside diner, while inside, the quiet became almost sacred, as though every person present understood they had just witnessed the difference between holding power and earning respect. No one spoke for several long seconds. The quiet inside the diner no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt reflective, almost as though the room itself had taken a deep breath. Officer Ethan Walker stood motionless near Angela Brooks's table, the weight on his shoulders far heavier than the equipment attached to his uniform. Outside the front windows, a gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across the parking lot, while sunlight painted warm bands of gold across the booths where breakfast had nearly been forgotten. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer chimed softly, reminding everyone that ordinary life continued even after extraordinary moments. Angela slowly reached for her coffee cup, now freshly poured by the waitress, and wrapped both hands around it. The warmth rose gently through the ceramic into her fingers. She did not drink immediately. Instead, she looked at the steam drifting upward until it disappeared into the morning light. Michael Hayes remained several feet behind her, saying nothing. David Collins quietly closed the leather folder he had been carrying since arriving. Neither man attempted to speak for the senator. They understood that the most powerful voice in the room would be the one that chose calm over victory. Walker finally cleared his throat. His words came more slowly than before. "Senator Brooks, I owe you an apology." Angela lifted her eyes toward him. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only attentiveness. Walker continued, struggling to find the right words. "I should have verified the facts before reaching my conclusions. I allowed assumptions to guide my decisions, and that was wrong." The little boy looked up at his mother, sensing that something important was happening even if he could not yet understand every sentence. The waitress quietly placed a slice of warm apple pie on the counter, but made no move to serve it. Even the cooks remained near the service window, watching with quiet respect. Angela set her coffee cup back onto the table. The soft sound of ceramic touching polished wood seemed louder than usual in the stillness. "Officer," she said gently. Every person who walks through a door carries a story that cannot be seen from the outside. Some wear expensive suits. Others wear work boots. Some arrive with titles. Others never receive recognition at all. But every one of them deserves the same measure of dignity before judgment is passed. Her voice never rose above conversation level, yet every word reached the farthest corner of the diner. Walker lowered his eyes for a moment. The confidence that had filled him earlier had given way to something far more difficult and far more valuable: honest reflection. He realized that if the governor had never called, if Michael Hayes had never walked through the door, if the frightened little boy had remained silent, the outcome might have been very different. That realization settled deeply within him. Angela noticed the thought crossing his face. "This morning is not only about me," she continued. "I will leave here and continue my work. But many people who face moments like this do not have someone waiting to confirm who they are. Their character should be enough until the facts are known." The elderly gentleman near the window slowly nodded, his weathered hands resting on the brim of his cap. A construction worker quietly whispered, "She is right," though no one seemed surprised by the words. The sunlight shifted again, filling the diner with a warmer glow than before. It reflected gently from the coffee cups, the chrome napkin holders, and the glass front door where the American flag could still be seen moving peacefully outside. In that quiet morning, the room no longer felt divided by authority or status. It felt united by a simple truth that every person present would remember long after breakfast had ended. The quiet reflection inside the diner lasted only until another sound gently interrupted the stillness. Michael Hayes's phone vibrated once against the polished wooden table. He glanced at the screen, nodded respectfully, and walked a few steps toward Angela Brooks before speaking in a low voice that everyone nearby could still hear. "Senator, the governor's chief of staff has confirmed that the Department of Public Safety has already opened a formal administrative review." Angela acknowledged him with a slight nod, neither surprised nor pleased. She simply accepted the information with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the morning. Officer Ethan Walker looked up immediately. His face revealed that he understood exactly what those words meant. Administrative reviews did not begin unless senior leadership believed something serious required examination. For the first time that morning, the consequences were no longer abstract. They had become real. The dispatcher called through his radio again, this time with a quieter, almost sympathetic tone. "Officer Walker, your supervising captain has instructed you to return to the district office immediately after clearing the scene. Another officer will complete any remaining reports." Walker answered softly, "Understood." His voice sounded different now, stripped of certainty and carried instead by acceptance. He clipped the radio back onto his shoulder and slowly removed his patrol notebook from his pocket. For a long moment, he stared at the blank pages without writing a single word. Across the diner, the customers resumed breathing as though they had all been holding their breath together. The little boy smiled at Angela before climbing onto the booth beside his mother. The waitress finally carried the warm slice of apple pie to Angela's table. "This is on the house," she said quietly. Angela looked up with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, but I would rather pay for it." The waitress smiled through damp eyes. "Then let me thank you another way. You reminded us what kindness looks like." Angela reached into her wallet and placed enough cash on the table to cover not only her own breakfast, but also the meals of the young mother and her son. "Please make sure they do not receive a bill today," she said gently. The waitress looked at the folded bills, then back at Angela, unable to hide her admiration. Walker witnessed the exchange without speaking. Only minutes earlier he had viewed the woman before him through the narrow lens of assumption. Now he watched her quietly extend generosity to strangers who had shared only a few moments of her morning. The realization settled deeply within him. Character had been visible from the very beginning. He simply had not chosen to see it. Michael Hayes stepped closer to Walker and offered a courteous handshake. There was no sarcasm in the gesture, no attempt to embarrass him. Walker hesitated before accepting it. "Everyone has difficult days," Hayes said calmly. "What matters is what we learn from them." Walker nodded slowly. "I intend to learn." Outside, sunlight sparkled across the windshield of the patrol vehicle while another gentle breeze lifted the flag above the diner. Inside, conversations gradually returned, coffee cups were lifted once more, and breakfast resumed. Yet the atmosphere had changed forever. The people who had entered the diner expecting an ordinary morning would leave carrying a memory that reached far beyond politics, uniforms, or titles. They had watched respect quietly reclaim the space where prejudice had briefly stood, and no one in the room would ever forget how silently that transformation had begun. Nearly an hour later, the morning sun had climbed higher, filling the diner with bright natural light that erased the long shadows stretching across the floor. The breakfast rush had slowly returned, but conversations remained softer than usual, as though everyone instinctively understood they had shared something worth protecting. Senator Angela Brooks rose from her booth at last, smoothing the sleeve of her navy sweater before placing a folded receipt beneath the empty coffee cup. She thanked the waitress by name after reading it from the small embroidered tag on her apron. "Thank you, Emily. The coffee was wonderful." Emily smiled with watery eyes. "Thank you for showing all of us something even better." Angela picked up her coat and turned toward the front door, but before she could leave, Officer Ethan Walker spoke again. "Senator, may I ask you one question?" She stopped and faced him without hesitation. "Of course." Walker stood quietly for a moment, searching for words that did not come easily. "When you realized who I thought you were, why did you never tell me your title immediately?" The question settled gently over the room. Even Michael Hayes looked toward Angela with quiet curiosity. She answered after a thoughtful pause. "Because for a few minutes, I was not thinking about being a senator." She glanced around the diner, meeting the eyes of the truck drivers, the cooks, the young mother, the elderly couple, and finally the little boy who smiled back at her. "I was thinking about every person who does not have a title that changes how they are treated. If respect only appears after someone proves their importance, then it is not really respect. It is recognition of status." Walker lowered his eyes. Her words carried no anger, only truth. "I understand," he said quietly. Angela offered a gentle smile. "I hope so. Every morning, you meet people at moments they will remember for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the uniform introduces you before your words ever can. That is a responsibility, not a privilege." The officer nodded slowly. There was nothing left to defend, only something to carry forward. At that moment his phone vibrated once inside his uniform pocket. He glanced at the screen and immediately understood the significance of the message. It was an official notification from the department confirming that he had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review ordered earlier that morning. He read the message silently before locking the screen again. His shoulders fell slightly, not from surprise, but from acceptance. He looked toward Angela one final time. "I hope I earn back the trust one damaged today." She answered with quiet sincerity. Growth always begins with honesty. Outside, the little boy hurried toward Angela before she reached the sidewalk. He handed her a folded drawing he had made on the back of a children's menu while everyone had been talking. It showed two stick figures standing beneath an American flag with the words, "Thank you for helping me," written in large, uneven letters. Angela accepted it with both hands as though it were the most valuable gift she had received all year. "I will keep this," she promised. The boy beamed. His mother smiled with relief, knowing her son would remember this day not because of confusion or fear, but because he had witnessed grace in its simplest form. Angela stepped into the bright morning sunlight, the drawing carefully tucked inside her notebook, while behind her the small roadside diner returned to its ordinary rhythm, forever changed by the extraordinary kindness that had quietly passed through its doors. 3 weeks later, autumn sunlight washed across the stone steps of the state capitol as reporters gathered for an ordinary policy briefing that quietly carried an extraordinary ending. Senator Angela Brooks stood behind a simple wooden podium, not surrounded by dramatic banners or applause, but by teachers, small business owners, veterans, and local residents she had met during her rural listening tour. She never mentioned the diner by name. She never mentioned Officer Ethan Walker. She never described the mourning that had spread quietly through communities across the state. Instead, she spoke about trust. "Every public servant," she said gently, "is given opportunities every single day to remind someone that they matter. Sometimes that happens in a courtroom. Sometimes it happens in a classroom. Sometimes it happens over a cup of coffee in a small town. Character is revealed in ordinary moments long before history remembers extraordinary ones." Her words traveled far beyond the Capitol walls. That same afternoon, The small diner was filled once again with familiar laughter, clinking dishes, and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and warm pie. Emily had framed the little boy's drawing beside the cash register with a handwritten note underneath that simply read, "Kindness changes the room before words ever can." Customers often stopped to look at it before placing their orders. Some smiled, some quietly nodded. Few knew the entire story, yet everyone seemed to understand its message. The little boy visited again with his mother every Saturday morning. Each time he walked through the front door, he looked at the framed picture and smiled a little wider than before. It reminded him that courage was not always loud. Sometimes it looked like a calm voice refusing to answer anger with anger. Officer Ethan Walker spent those same weeks attending additional professional training and meeting regularly with department leadership. The administrative review concluded with disciplinary action that included his removal from active duty and ultimately the loss of his position. The decision was not celebrated publicly, nor was it used to humiliate him. It was presented as accountability and as a reminder that public trust must be protected through actions, not titles. Walker accepted the outcome without protest. He carried with him the memory of one quiet morning when assumptions had spoken louder than facts, and he understood that rebuilding integrity would require far more than words. Months later, on a cool winter afternoon, Angela received a handwritten envelope without a return address. Inside was a short note written in careful blue ink. "Thank you for showing me that dignity is stronger than pride. I cannot change that morning, but I can choose who I become because of it." There was no signature, yet she immediately recognized its meaning. Angela folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the child's drawing inside the same notebook she carried everywhere she traveled. She closed the cover with a gentle smile before looking through her office window at the American flag moving quietly against the pale blue sky. The afternoon light reflected across the glass, filling the room with a warm golden glow. She took a slow breath, gathered her notes for the next community meeting, and walked toward the door with the same steady grace she had carried into that small roadside diner. Outside, people waited not for a title, not for a headline, but for someone willing to listen. And somewhere beyond the sound of traffic and distant voices, justice left no echo at all. It simply settled into ordinary hearts, one quiet act of respect at a time.